What's unnerving for so many of us right now is that everything about our experience has become liminal all at the same time.
Jewels in your crown.
Jewels in your...
The community heard him cry. The community watched him die.
God's already been in all of my tomorrows.
Jesus wept. Jesus wept when he walked this earth.
Welcome, everyone, to the 50th episode of the Louisiana Now podcast. We are so glad to have you along with us and so glad that you have been making the Louisiana Now podcast part of your routine. Now, because we've reached the 50th episode, we thought it would be a great time to share some of the best moments from some of our better episodes. We have covered a lot of ground here on the podcast. We started in February with our very first episode, a conversation with Bishop Cynthia Fierro Harvey. It's a conversation that covered everything from the mediation protocol to Joe Burrow, LSU's quarterback. And never once in that first episode back in February did we discuss a pandemic. After all, it wasn't even a thing to worry about, but the pandemic would arrive just a few weeks after, and everything, as you know, changed. And to be honest, it was a reaffirmation of our work here on the Louisiana Now podcast. We knew we wanted to start the podcast, but after the pandemic, we quickly realized that it was the best germ-free way to share stories. So today, we'll go back in time in this crazy year known as 2020 and share some of the moments from our first 50 episodes. We begin with our most frequent guest, Bishop Harvey. Little did we know that when we recorded our very first episode in February, that a pandemic would alter life and church life for generations to come. In the midst of the pandemic outbreak, we celebrated Easter. Hear now Bishop Harvey on the focus of Easter in the midst of a pandemic.
Every day is a resurrection day for us. And I am convinced that that God has already been there. God was here yesterday, is here today, and tomorrow, and God's already been in all of my tomorrows. So we are resurrection people of hope, people of love, people of compassion. And if no other time, there's no better time for us than this time to celebrate the resurrection story, to tell the Easter story, to read the Easter story, to embody the Easter story. So for such a time as this, we are here and we've got all the tools we need. We've got all the tools that we need.
In April, we visited with Reverend Tiffany Lyon, Associate Pastor at First UMC in Slidell and a chaplain at Ochsner Medical Center in New Orleans. The episode, Angels on the Front Lines. Reverend Lyon was and continues to be busy comforting patients and family members, and we wanted to get a sense of not only what she was seeing in the hospitals, but where she might be witnessing God in the midst of everything.
I think leaning into our faith and our relationship with Christ is more important than ever now during this and during any type of crisis, be it personal or worldwide, and to help us deal better with less anxiety. And we always are going to have uncertainty. We're always going to have unknown. And I would never, ever claim that God initiated this on us, but I do believe that in uncertain and scary times, we need to trust, that the Holy One is in the midst of it all. And whether you have high or low Christology, we need to remember too that Jesus wept. Jesus wept when he walked this earth, and he cries when we cry. And I think it's trusting not only that triune God that we Christians believe in, but also have hope and trust in humanity that we can come together through this. And I think we're seeing it in a lot of, simple but powerful ways just around our neighborhoods. And we'll always have that human brokenness and selfishness and power and greed, but Jesus is there in the end, and God's love is the one thing that is true and steadfast. And that makes things just a little easier, at least for me.
As you know, the pandemic has not gone away. In fact, as I record this in mid-November, in some ways, it's getting worse. But there is news of a promising vaccine potentially on the way. You may remember that we visited with Dillard University President Dr. Walter Kimbrough, who is participating in a vaccine trial for COVID-19. In that episode, we heard more about why he decided to do it and what it's been like.
Yeah, I'm telling people that if you would rather have people who volunteer to participate in a study than for you to be experimented on. Because if a vaccine is created and you take a vaccine and you get sick because it doesn't work, that means they got to go back and figure out, like, okay, so what do we do? Do we do another dose? Do we change this? So now you're volunteering for, an experiment, but it's a little bit more critical because obviously something went wrong. And so we don't have enough people who volunteer so that other people don't have to go through the pain of being experimented on. For example, when the actor Chadwick Boseman died, a lot of people started talking about prostate cancer, particularly as it increases in Black men. But one of the first things I heard, there are not enough Blacks in the oncology studies. So everybody mourns this 43-year-old actor who's at the height of his career who dies. And part of the reason he dies is that we don't have enough people volunteering so they could study it, so he could be treated and not die. So it's a bigger question. So we got to start saying you don't need a lot of people, but you do want some people to volunteer.
Another major focus of the Louisiana Now podcast this year has been hurricanes. 7 times this year, we were at some point in a storm's cone of uncertainty. Before we get to the highlights of our storm coverage, I wanted to take a moment and thank our sponsor, the United Methodist Foundation of Louisiana. As you know, they've been with us since the start. The foundation was quick to find the value in storytelling specifically with this format, and President Rob Fairley has supported us, and we thank everyone at the foundation for their continued support. They, too, have been leading and adapting in ways they never thought they would. They've been helping churches who need help outfitting their worship experiences with digital equipment. They've been assisting churches in the Lake Charles district and beyond with low to no interest loans, and they've been a trusted ally in the midst of a season of unknowns. They've also been hosting a series of webinars over the last few months, topics ranging from communication to finances. You can head over to their website to view those recorded webinars and to also find out how the foundation can help you and your church. The website, umf.org. Back now to the show. We were about to share our highlights of the hurricane season. The Lake Charles district was devastated by back-to-back storms, and our reporting from the ground got the most shares of any of our episodes. And we thank you for that. Sharing our podcast is one of the best ways we can grow. One of our most shared episodes, Jewels in Your Crown. We followed some of the many volunteers who helped during a recent cleanup day in DeRidder, including students from LSU's Wesley Foundation.
So we had 7 students from the very beginning, the moment we knew Hurricane Laura was going to hit, have a heart to want to come out and serve this community. And so when we had this opportunity to come up today, they gave up their Saturday. They took the time off of doing schoolwork or hanging out, relaxing, to come and serve this community because they just have a heart of Christ and they have a servant's heart. And it's one of our big foundations at the Wesley Foundation is to serve not only the Baton Rouge community, but our Louisiana community and the world.
You mentioned that it's a Saturday and they could be doing other things, right? I mean, this really is the epitome of service.
Yes. I am always amazed how willing my students are to give up their free time to come out and to serve, to do hard labor as moving trees or whatever it is. They continue to impress me, and it just shows that they are disciples of Jesus Christ. They want to be Jesus' hands and feet in the world.
They were indeed moving trees, lots of downed trees, specifically downed trees from the backyard of Miss Catherine, who can't get around as easily as college kids.
I'm 91.
Miss Catherine was born at this house, and she's lived here her entire life.
I can remember when they had mules and they raised all kind of stuff. We had cows and sheep.
What is it like to see all these young people picking up debris in your back. You don't even know who these people are.
I don't, and they're just all smiles. They're enjoying what they're doing. I just can't believe everything was a mess, and I lost a lot of trees, and everybody has just pitched in and helped. And all I had to do was ask, and they were right here.
I was visiting with Miss Catherine, the 91-year-old who lives, this is her property. And when I asked her what this was like, what does this say about the kingdom of God, Catherine?
Jewels in your crown.
Jewels in your crown?
Yes, yes.
She said she described it as jewels in their crown.
That's amazing. That's amazing. And I think it's so true.
The Lord is good, yes.
How are you doing through all this, Catherine?
I'm doing good. I'm doing really good. Yes. I mean, what can you ask ask for? And it's all here by the grace of God.
Thank you for visiting with me.
Welcome. Thank you for asking.
We have also navigated the pain of racial injustice here on the Louisiana Now podcast. Another of our most listened to podcast episodes, we took you to Minneapolis, the city where George Floyd was killed. And we visited with Reverend Greg Taylor, who had just moved to town from Houston. Within days of his arrival, George Floyd was killed just 4 blocks away from his new church, Park Avenue United Methodist Church.
I have to follow Black leaders in the Black community, faith leaders. And that's been my education, Todd. Over the last few years, it's been a journey for me to realize my own ignorance in all of this. And I need to could learn and continue to learn and be led by friends in the Black community, their experience, because it's stupid for me to assume that I know more than they know. So for me, definitely, I think that's, I have to be in that posture, and in that practice, and be willing to be corrected when I'm not. And I would also say that I think it's paramount for any white person to take that posture and practice as well. For 400 years, the Black community has been told by the white community what their experience should be, and what it is, and what to feel and what not to feel, and so much has been taken away. And I think for me, for a white person to assume that to speak for, the Black community is just another way of, taking away their voice. And I feel pretty strongly about that.
The summer of 2020 was difficult, but we made the effort to do the work of dismantling racism. The Louisiana Conference held a series of important webinars focused on that work. Those webinars have been archived and are available for your viewing on our website. Our partners, Project Curate. Here's Dr. Biko Mandalay Gray, a professor of religion at Syracuse University and a member of Project Curate, as he opened our episode on anti-Blackness back in July.
They came for him They criminalized him. They subdued him. They suffocated him. His lungs were giving out. His arms began to weaken. His eyes started to close. His voice was giving out. The community heard him cry. The community watched him die. No one did anything. No one could. He died. He died slowly. He died publicly. His name was Jesus.
There were several episodes focused on the work of dismantling racism. And I know, the conference knows, and you know as well, dismantling racism is hard work. It will take a considerable amount of prayer, effort, and a thirst for justice. But this particular episode, Anti-Blackness, challenged me in a very good way, and it was a challenge that led to enlightenment. Our guest at the time was Brandy Holmes, also with Project Curate. Brandy focuses her work on various Black liberation struggles as a noted social activist, community organizer, and strategist. And she also has ties to Louisiana. Listen now as she discussed a recent trip to the plantations in Louisiana.
And what was interesting to me is that Laura's plantation told a very interesting story about slavery. It told a very interesting story about the institution. Laura, in many ways, was glorified as a wonderfully ambitious, industrious woman who saw an opportunity to really excel her business and her life for those that she profited from. And the stories and the language that they were using was really interesting. The language they used we're talking about and referencing the slaves, right? And I think it's important for us to even pause here to think about the language that we use when we talk about slavery, right? The condition that folks found themselves were that they were enslaved, right? But when we use the terminology slave, that then allows us to place an identity mark on these individuals, which then further allows us to dehumanize, right? Which then makes it palpable that slavery was an institution that existed in this country, right? When we begin to glorify Laura's story and tell the story of how kind she was to those that she owned, but they were her friends that she cared for. She gave them wonderful clothes. She made sure they had heating in their cabins, right? When you begin to glorify the story of slavery, let's think about what that does to us as a general people when we begin to tell these stories. So I encourage us to think about the language that we use. I encourage us to think about the historical sites and symbols and markers. I encourage us to be a bit disturbed when we notice that a friend or family member chooses to have a wedding at a plantation. What does that really mean? Who's crying out from the grounds of those locations? What voices are being told? What stories can we hear from those moments?
Holmes continued to challenge us with narratives that we repeat, the media repeats, culture itself repeats.
We also watch in the media how those who are simply protesting and present with a sign are being met with extreme amounts of violence, militarization that has now been introduced. But we also see individuals who have AK-47s and are extremely hostile in the face of police, which seem to be able to return safely to their homes with no sort of hostility or resistance met with their presence. Let's ask ourselves these questions. Why is this happening? Who is this happening to? What does this mean for us as a people? I even think about this idea of unity, right? The festival and celebration that oftentimes happen. I love Louisiana, I love Mardi Gras, I love everything that goes on along these things, but I feel like it creates this sense of unity because there's this proximity to Blackness and proximity to culture, and yet the allure of this fantasy that creates a kinship, when in reality we don't really ask the question, what happens to the folks who return to the lower ninth after they come from Mardi Gras? What happens after February? What happens after March? Who are these folks that are deeply affected by the really very real realities of what's happening in these moments? So I encourage us all to begin to really interrogate not only what we think, but also about how we act. In many ways right now, what you were seeing is that folks believe that the pro-Black movement or the movement for Black lives is really an anti-white movement. And that's merely because the pro-Black movement, pro-white movements have always been anti-Black. Yet in this moment, we're seeing the folks basically demanding a call to justice and accountability. Oftentimes what's met in this moment, folks are very confused or concerned, and what we see is silence is the response.
If there has been one thing constant in 2020, it's that we don't know where we are going. In the most listened to episode of the Louisiana Now podcast, we were introduced to the term liminal with author Susan Beaumont as we unpacked her book, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You Are Going, Leading in a Liminal Season. The interview was at the perfect time for many of us.
The word itself the root of the word comes from the Latin word limen, and in Roman times, that word was used literally to talk about the threshold, the stone at the base of the threshold of a door, when someone would come from the outside to the inside and stop to clean their shoes off at that threshold place before coming into the inside. So liminality is a betwixt in between place. It's very disorienting, but it's also very freeing because it's a time when we're leaving behind something and we're letting go of some old assumptions and practices, but we are not yet fully knowing what the new thing is. So we have to just sit in the disorientation. And the reason
that's
I think
hard.
That's very hard.
That's hard, and it's not a good place to be in some way, right? I mean, it's challenging.
Right. But if we pay attention, we have been in liminal spaces all of our lives. We send our kids off to summer camps. We send adults on pilgrimages and mission trips. And we do that because we know we're sending people into a different space where they're transformed. And what we're sending them into is liminality, where they're in a place where none of the social constructs that have defined who they are go with them. They have to go raw into that liminal space, and it's there that they experience transformation, right? So if we and when we look at the desert mothers and fathers, they invited liminality as a way of life. Monasticism does that, tries to live in a liminal space. We know when we change pastors that we invite a congregation into liminality, into a space in between two styles of leadership. And we see how things get unfrozen there and how some rich new things are born. So it's not that we don't know what liminality is. What's unnerving for so many of us right now is that everything about our experience has become liminal all at the same time.
If there was ever an episode in the first 50 to properly orient us for 2020, it was that episode. It's titled, How to Lead When You Don't Know Where You're Going. We highly recommend it. There is probably a reason why it was the most listened to podcast episode. We'll include a link to that episode and all of the episodes that we featured today in our look back at the first 50 episodes of the Louisiana Now podcast. Which episode was your favorite? Drop us a line. Our email is podcast@la-umc.org. In fact, we would love to hear from you. Maybe you have an idea for the show. As we say goodbye, we know that this episode is airing during Thanksgiving week, and I just wanted to thank all of you for listening and supporting this podcast. We will continue to share the news, opportunities, and witness of our Louisiana Conference. For our producer, Mary Burley, I am your host, Todd Rossnagel. Thanks again for joining us.